Ms. McCall, do you have a submission? Please come forward. Yes.
Chair, yesterday an ad hoc Rule 9 application was made by Ms Mitchell, and it contained multiple proposed lines of questioning. I wish to address you in relation to one of the lines of questioning for which permission was sought. I had sent in advance, Chair, the transcript references, and I hope that you have them.
I have that.
The application in respect of the specific matter is found in the unrevised transcript, which is date 84, page 121, line 15, to page 122, line 11. And it relates to documents for which PIRC reference numbers were provided. Chair, you refused permission for that line of questioning to be pursued, and the refusal is found on page 124, lines 14 to 16. And the permission was refused on the basis that the issue was already adequately covered in the evidence. Thereafter, at page 137 from line 11, Ms Mitchell began to pursue the line of questioning for which permission had been refused, I've no doubt inadvertently. Chair, this is not an adversarial process where ordinarily parties might make objections and the judge is the referee. It being an inquisitorial process, it is in my submission a matter for the chair to control the conduct of proceedings. When the prohibited questioning began, sir, you did not intervene. Ms Mitchell continued to ask questions on the matter up to page 139 at line 14, contrary to the ruling that you had made. The result, Chair, is this. There is now material in the public record of the inquiry which was adduced contrary to a ruling made by you as chair of the inquiry. Sir, the issue is one of principle. A legal ruling was made and not complied with. My submission, therefore, is that you should rule that the evidence is not properly before the inquiry and will not be considered in your final determination. If that submission is upheld by you, then my supplementary motion is that steps be taken to redact the relevant passages from the published transcript and the video recording. That's my submission.
Thank you. I shall reflect on that submission. In the meantime, I have arranged for the transcript and the video recording of yesterday afternoon to be removed from the website.
Obliged.
Thank you. Ms Mitchell, I don't think you need to address me, do you?
Well, I'd like to.
Very well, I shall hear from you.
And most importantly, I want to tender my apology for having asked a question for which a refusal was given. And I think, as my learned friend indicated in her submission, she doesn't seem to suggest that it was on purpose. And of course, I would like to assure the inquiry of that. It was simply because I was scrolling down a long list of questions that I was being allowed to ask and not being allowed to ask, and trying to
I accept that, Ms Mitchell.
I'm obliged. The second thing I would suppose I would say, my lord, is the evidence which was adduced as a result of that question, which this inquiry heard, was as a result of an error in respect of the ruling on questions to be asked. The reason for the ruling was that you said the evidence could be adduced elsewhere. And indeed, of course, it had been adduced that those things had been said in the statements. However, you will remember what this witness said yesterday. When I mentioned the issue of the statements, he said, I know what you're going to say. and he said it's about the word coloured. And for the first time in this inquiry, members of the PIRC apologised for failing to identify a comment which was offensive and racist and ought to have been flagged up. Now, I would respectfully submit that, albeit from my genuine error, that evidence was adduced. It is an additional piece of evidence that I would respectfully submit would be important for the inquiry to consider, because it has importance, it has merit, and it has weight. And whilst it came out in circumstances which are unfortunate, I would respectfully submit that it would be more unfortunate if this inquiry were to take the view that what the inquiry may come to see as a genuine and heartfelt apology, that's a matter for the inquiry, would be removed from public knowledge in these circumstances.
Thank you.
I'm obliged.
Could I have the witness now, please? Good morning, Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning, my lord.
Will you take the oath?
I will.
If you just remain seated.
Okay.
I swear by Almighty
I
God
swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning, Miss Graham.
You are John Mitchell.
I am, yes.
What age are you?
I'm 65 years old.
And you're currently retired.
I am
as
retired,
understand
yes.
it. And you served with Strathclyde Police for 34 years
34 years, yes.
and retired from the police in July 2012.
That's correct, yes.
So that was before they became Police Scotland.
It was just as they're up to Police Scotland.
Right. And I understand the majority of that time you spent in the CID.
I did, yes.
And you spent around 25, 26 years working on investigations with them.
That's correct, yes.
And when you retired, you were a detective chief superintendent in charge of the CID in Strathclyde.
In charge of criminal operations within Strathclyde, yes.
And I think we'll come on to, in a moment, your inquiry statement. And I think you detail a number of the areas of work that you undertook
Yes.
during that time with Strathclyde.
Yes.
You then, could you give me one moment, please, Mr. Mitchell? I wonder if it would be possible to have a very brief adjournment at the moment.
Sorry, Mr. Mitchell, we're going to have a short adjournment.
Okay.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell,
Ms. Graham.
I think you may have had the opportunity to see occasional bits of evidence from the inquiry.
Occasional pieces, yes.
Yes. So you will probably know that there is a blue folder in front of you.
Yes, indeed.
And there are hard copies of documents that you may find to be of assistance. Please open it. Please look at any of the documents that are in there.
Thank you.
As I go through the questions, you'll probably be aware that I will ask for statements and documents to be brought up on the screen,
Yes.
so everyone can see them. And I'll refer to a particular paragraph, perhaps. If you wish to follow along on the screen, that's fine. If you prefer to have the hard copy in front of you, you've got that for your statement.
Thank you.
You may also have seen occasionally a witness will ask for a particular document or remember something that they've seen in the past. If I can't get that on the screen immediately, we will try and get it at the next break.
I understand.
So anything at all that you think might help you, please let us know and we'll see what we can do.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Let's look first of all at your inquiry statement. So this is SBPI 00423. And you'll see that coming up onto the screen. And this is your inquiry statement, John Mitchell, and it was taken over the course of 3 days in October last year.
That's correct, yes.
And it's 160 pages long. And if we look at the final page, we'll see that it was signed by you on the 15th of December 2023.
That's correct, yes.
Your signature's
I see
redacted on the
that.
hard copy.
Yes.
You'll see that you've signed every page.
Yes, I do see that.
And if we look at the final paragraph, which is 667, it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And you understood that to be the case when you signed it.
I did, yes.
Thank you. And you've done your best to give a true and accurate record of your recollections, although I understand you retired from PIRC in 2018.
That's correct. In March 2018, coming up in 6 years now. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. I would like to begin by asking you questions about the time when you were preparing for PIRC
Yes.
coming into existence. And we've heard evidence that it was created on the 1st of April 2013.
That's correct.
And as I understand it, you were involved prior to that with a view to actually pulling everything together, if I can call it that.
I was, yes.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 5 of your inquiry statement? And I think here you set out in some detail your role and how you became involved. And you say here, after you retired, you were contacted and asked if you would be able and willing to assist the Scottish Government in finalising an investigative team which would be attached to the existing Police Complaints Commissioner for Scotland, the PCCS. Now, as I understand it, before April 2013, the body that existed was the Complaints Commission.
Complaints Commission for Scotland, that's correct, yes.
And they did more case handling, they reviewed things on paper, but there wasn't an investigative team attached to that.
No, that's correct. The review team purely and simply reviewed the manner in which Police Scotland had handled complaints about Police Scotland and made recommendations around that.
And that was done on paper.
It was a paper office-based process.
And there was a decision made that that would change.
Yes.
And for that purpose, they created a new body called PIRC.
Yes.
And as part of that new body, the paperwork and the complaints handling was still part of it. But in addition, they created an investigative team.
That's correct.
And the team were to do what? What was their new role to be?
In real terms, it was to investigate matters relating to the police. Serious matters. There were two separate areas of business. Those areas which were either referred by the Chief Constable to the Commissioner for consideration of an investigation, or indeed if the Commissioner decided that there was in the public interest to have an investigation, to conduct that investigation. And then over and above that, there was also the provision for the Crown Office to direct the Commissioner to conduct investigations into allegations of criminality about the police, or where it was found necessary to investigate the matters surrounding a death in police custody, for example, which would go to a fatal accident inquiry.
And that new investigative team would involve actual investigators going out, maybe knocking on doors, maybe researching issues regarding forensic matters.
Absolutely, that was it. It was in an investigative role, and it did include interviewing members of the public, liaising with, as you quite rightly say, forensic experts, for example, and conducting a full investigation into the circumstances, and then reporting back to either the Crown in a Crown-directed investigation, or the Chief Constable, where the Chief Constable had requested that investigation be conducted.
Thank you. Now, without going to paragraph 629 in your statement, you've told us you retired from the police in July 2012. You said in your statement you were appointed to this role with PIRC in November 2012.
That's correct, the 1st of November 2012.
Right. And as we've said, there was no investigative side at that stage. So were you starting effectively with a blank sheet?
Well, I actually started working along with the Scottish Government Justice Department Police Division at the end of July 2012 to pull together an options paper to describe or to lay out plans as to how I might see an investigation unit working and how the setup should be.
Was that at the end of your time with the police?
Yes, I had retired from the police and gone on a short holiday, and on return from holiday I was contacted initially by, it was Mr Ian Livingston, who at that time formed part of the working group moving towards Police Scotland, and I was introduced to members of Police Division within the Scottish Government who were chairing the working group in relation to the police investigations in the new Commissioner as it would become.
So were the creation of Police Scotland was also on the 1st of April 2013?
Yes, indeed.
And work was obviously commencing and being discussed at that stage. Was the establishment of this new body PIRC also running in tandem with that?
It was important that such a body was available from the 1st of April 2013 to take on investigations which hitherto would have been undertaken by the police themselves.
So in the past, the police would have investigated the police?
Yes, it wasn't unusual maybe for the Chief Constable of, say, the then Dumfries and Galloway force to approach a Chief Constable in one of the other 8 police services in Scotland and ask them to conduct an investigation on their behalf.
And we've heard from other witnesses that developments in relation to human rights, and in particular Article 2.
Yes, Article 2 and 3 were
2 and 3.
central to the thought process behind the PIRC investigations unit.
And was it appreciated then that the independence was something that should be strived to be achieved?
Yes, absolutely it was, yes.
And part of that was establishing PIRC.
Yes, indeed.
And we've also heard evidence that the independence of that investigation is very significant to PIRC.
Yes.
Thank you. And so on the 1st of April 2013, when PIRC came into existence, was that also coincided with the end of the PCCS?
Yes, that
completely came to an end?
Absolutely, yes.
And I'd like to know about your role. So you've talked about being involved in July 2012 after you'd retired and being spoken to by Ian Livingston. Tell us, did you actually start your role with what was to be PIRC in the November, or was there a period during July and November that you were working on this matter?
Between July and November I worked through the Scottish Government. I suppose technically I was self-employed. I was not a member of the PIRC at that time. that didn't occur until my appointment on the 1st of November. In the early stages, as I say, I answered directly to Police Division within Scottish Government, and it was to them that I was producing papers and ideas, and in order to move forward the requirement for an investigative ability by the 1st of April 2013.
And did you have a team to help you with that, or was it just you yourself?
No, generally it was me myself. There were a couple of police officers from Police Scotland, the Professional Standards Department, who had been seconded to Scottish Government at that time as well, but more generally the responsibility fell to me to pull together an investigative unit.
So on the 1st of November 2012, when you started officially with PIRC, although they weren't created until the following year, tell us about your role from that date.
Should I go back slightly further than that?
If it helps,
Yes,
please
so,
do.
so ultimately in July I met with the Scottish Government. They explained the requirement of an independent body to be up and running by the 1st of April 2013. I spent the next few months visiting similar bodies in the United Kingdom and in Southern Ireland, the Ombudsman for Strathcona and the PSNI Ombudsman, and the complaints set up in England as well, trying to get an idea of how these organisations were set up and how they worked. I then pulled together, as I say, an options paper which was presented to Scottish Government and was discussed at the steering group meeting. That ultimately was accepted, and then interviews took place. I was interviewed along with others for the role of Director of Investigations, and after that was appointed on the 1st of November. So I then became a member of the PIRC staff at that time, albeit still under the title of the Police Complaints Commission for Scotland, because the legislation didn't come into effect until the 1st of April 2013.
Right. And you were appointed as Director of Investigations.
Yes, that was the decision of the then Commissioner to use that title, yes.
And when was the actual Commissioner appointed?
Now, the Commissioner at that time was Professor John McNeill, and he had been the Commissioner in relation to the Police Complaints Authority and remained in that position up until 2014, I believe. So he was still the Commissioner when it became PIRC on the 1st of April and continued in that role until 2014, I believe, when he was replaced by Kate Frame. Sorry.
I was going to say, we may hear from Kate Frame later that she started in August 2014.
Yeah, well, yes, that would be right.
That would
yes.
tie in with
yes,
what you're
that's,
saying.
Yes, from memory, that would be correct.
So the Commissioner for the previous body continued
Yes, he did.
beyond the creation of PIRC.
Yes, indeed.
And you became Director of Investigations.
I did, yes.
And was that really the top of the tree in terms of the investigations team?
It was, yes.
And were you immediately below the Commissioner in terms of seniority?
Yes, as far as the investigation side was concerned, I had a similar level of, in the complaint section, there was a gentleman there who ran that side of business, but my role was specifically around investigations, and yes, I was the highest level within that investigative role.
And you 1st November 2012, you're in that role. Were any other members of the investigation team in place at that time?
None. That's when we started the recruitment process.
Right. And tell us about that recruitment process.
Well, the biggest challenge for us at that time was the time frame, Lord. We had between the 1st of November, me taking up post, and the 1st of April the following year to pull together investigative capacity and capability that would be able to take on the types of investigation that the statutory requirement on the Commissioner outlined.
Is that around 5 months?
Just around 5 months, yes. It was tight, and a big challenge around it was just understanding how much work, what the demand profile of the organisation would be. It wasn't sufficient just to count the number of inquiries that had gone in years previous, and even that was difficult because we found that each of the different police services counted these things differently. So there was challenges around that. With support of the corporate services unit that was in PCCS at that time, we then went out and advertised for interested parties to apply for roles as investigators within the organisation.
So were you heavily involved with recruiting from the 1st of November?
Yes, I looked closely at job descriptions, etc., from other like organisations. I identified the types of skills that I believed, from my experience, that investigators would need. And then again, as I say, with the assistance of corporate services within PCCS at that time, we advertised in newspapers and outlets where corporate services having that experience, believed that we would better reach the type of person, individual we were looking for.
Was diversity considered at that stage in terms of the recruitment process?
Not directly, I would say, not directly. It was more around the experience and of the roles that had to be filled. It was more related to that.
And what were you looking for in terms of experience?
Well, we needed to recruit people who had undertaken major investigations, to be quite honest with you. There are certain roles that you just can't do without. So there had to have people who had seen management experience, for example, who were experienced in dealing with witnesses, family liaison type experience. We needed people who had an understanding of interview techniques, of Scottish criminal law. So ultimately, it was investigators who could display a knowledge of and having been involved in investigations which may end up in a criminal court or a review to Police Scotland. So people who understood the process.
Did you envisage at that stage that effectively the PIRC investigators would to some extent replicate the role of police investigators?
They had to, simply because of the type of investigation, particularly when it became a Crown-directed investigation into whether there had been criminal acts by a police officer or whether there had been a death in police custody or any death relating to the police for that matter.
We've heard that Crown-led investigations can be either B1, which is into criminal conduct, or B2 into the circumstances of a death that may result in an FAI.
Yes.
Is that's correct?
That's correct, yes. Section 33 of that.
So at the very least in relation to Crown-led investigations, a B1 would be into criminal allegations. And so you would want investigators to be able to understand the procedures.
Most certainly.
And you've also mentioned family liaison, crime scene management, interview techniques. Yeah. These would all be the type of roles that police officers would traditionally be.
They are, because more generally it's the only area these specialities are used.
Right. What were your views at that stage of the recruitment about the importance of independence?
Again, I looked at the whole matter of independence and how it was described, and the way it was described and I read was that so long as the body conducting the investigation were not hierarchically linked to those being investigated, that appeared to me, and I sought other advice in relation to that, to meet the needs generally of independence. Now, so ultimately not to have any serving police officers within the organisation.
So when you said not hierarchically linked, you mean no serving officers?
No, not serving officers. No one in the service of or being paid by Police Scotland. Everyone within the investigations unit was employed by PIRC and were under the control of the Commissioner.
So in terms of balancing the need for people with experience in investigations, but not people who are engaged by Police Scotland,
Yes.
as they would become, how did you decide to balance that?
Well, again, it was through the interview process. So people applied, we considered their application, we considered the amount of experience that they had. We interviewed them and we decided at that stage, with a balance in mind, that whether we had identified the right people. So as a result, we did employ initially people with varied backgrounds.
We may come on to this later, but I understand there was a lot of former or retired police officers. Is
There
that
were,
correct?
there were.
Yeah. And you say there were people from varied backgrounds.
Yes.
Tell us about the variety.
Well, we had people from the military. We had a member of staff who had previously worked with the Crown Office, Procurator, Fiscal Service, and indeed worked within the deaths unit. We had someone from Trading Standards. We had ex-fire investigators. We had border officers. And indeed my deputy came from the Care Inspectorate.
Who was your deputy?
It was Irene Scullion.
We've heard Ms. Scullion's name. Was she head of investigations?
She was. As I said, the instigation of the whole process, the Commissioner at that time, Professor McNeill, didn't have a particularly strong experience of criminal investigations, if at all. It was him who decided that my role would be that of director, and initially to support him greatly through the process because of his lack of a criminal knowledge background. And he then suggested strongly that I should have a deputy to take on the roles below that, but have a controlling hand on the investigations team.
So can you explain to the chair the distinction between those roles, you as Director of Investigations at the top of that team, and Irene Scullion as Head of Investigations?
I suppose my role was more strategic and in support of the Commissioner at that time. It was more around liaising with other bodies who we would come across. It was to get the message across of who we were and what we did. However, there were occasions that our roles would cross over. There's absolutely no doubts about that. And it was a support function as well, because we were going through a new process. There was leave, there was responsibilities, there was meetings, and so there was always someone at the appropriate level there to take control if that was necessary.
And we've heard that there was you as Director at
Yes.
the top, Irene Scullion as Head
Yes,
below you. There were then senior investigators.
there were, yes.
We've heard the name of Richard Casey.
Richard Casey.
And then there were deputy senior
There were,
investigators.
yes.
And Mr. Harrower was a senior investigator, I think, at one stage.
At one stage he was, I
became
think,
one.
I think just as I actually retired. Prior to that, he had been employed as a deputy senior investigator.
I think the deputy senior investigators were at that next level, and then below that there were investigators.
General investigators, yes.
And we've also heard evidence that there were roughly around 20 in the team.
That would be correct at the
And
outset.
then you and Irene Scullion, effectively it was 22 in that entire investigations team.
That would be correct, yes.
And looking at the issue of resources, you've talked about working with the Scottish Government
Yes.
and doing papers,
Yeah,
working with the working group. You've talked about coming in as director initially, and then Irene Scullion comes in
yes.
as your deputy effectively. How long did it take you to recruit the remaining members of the team?
It took through until nearly the end of January from memory, and even maybe beyond that, because we reached a set of circumstances where we believed that we had recruited a team, and one or two people then dropped out and we had to re-recruit. So it would be round about the mid to the end of January where we had the bulk of the team in place.
And in terms of your role, once you had the team in place,
Yeah.
what steps did you take in terms of bringing them together, getting them ready to start on the 1st of April 2013?
So you're right, we did gather them together, and at that time we had office premises out in Paisley, because even that hadn't been settled by the time January arrived. There was still work ongoing in relation to the business area that we would use, the office space that we would use. So during that time that we had between January and the start of the PIRC on the 1st of April, we got a better understanding of the skills that the individuals had. We sat down and we spoke greatly about the legislation that pulled the PIRC into place. We also talked about the powers that the legislation, both the 2006 Act and the other acts, gave the investigators. And we tried desktop exercises in relation to responding to incidents, etc. So we laid the ground rules of the expectations if the staff were called to incidents.
I'm very interested in the desktop exercises.
Yeah.
Would you call this part of the training of the team?
Yes, I think yes. It was in-house training. So we took, for example, an incident relating to a police shooting, what the expectation would be if that call was received. So, and tried to bring people up to speed with the requirements of that type of investigation, how it would look from our perspective, what our expectations of the police would be at that time, and talked it through and tried to make it fit into the legislative framework. And again, tried to express to people who did not come from a police background initially what powers they had in terms of conducting investigations. Whilst conducting investigation under the direction of the Crown Office, the investigators had the same powers as a constable.
And these desktop exercises, were there examples created that were then discussed through? How did you actually work through those exercises?
Yes, we did, and not just in January. That continued after the 1st of April that year. It was, for example, we managed to get some of our investigators to go to and listen to a fatal accident inquiry, to get an understanding of the role of fatal accident inquiries. Again, we considered and sent certain investigators to training days with Police Scotland, where the post-incident management process for a firearms incident was being explained. So it was all about building up one refreshing experience of those who already had the knowledge, but building experience to those who hadn't been involved in that type of investigation previously.
Right. And you said that one was a shooting, you sent them to an FAI and they went to see a post-incident management procedure.
Yes.
Were there any other examples that were used to allow the team to work through how an investigation should look? Were there any deaths in custody?
No, not that I recall at that stage, no.
Any deaths involving anyone of an ethnic minority?
No, but as regards to deaths in custody, yes, we did use the experience of the staff member who had come from COPS and who had worked in the Scottish Deaths Unit to explain to the staff what the desk unit would expect from an investigation like that.
Tell us about that work that was done.
Again, it was delivered in-house. We had previously discussed the response to an investigation of that sort, and then we used that member of staff's experience working in the Crown Office department to explain what type and in what format the Crown would expect to receive evidence, and then that bolted on to sending them to hear a fatal accident inquiry and get an understanding of the way the fatal accident inquiry was conducted.
And this former member of Crown Office was an investigator. What was their name?
I knew you were going to ask that for the life of me. I'm sorry, 9 years ago. She wasn't with us particularly long because she returned to a legal post within maybe a year to a year and a half. But I'm sorry, I just
Someone
don't
will
remember.
no doubt be able to
Yes, I'm
give me
sorry.
the answer to that. We'll come back to that. So this former member of Crown Office led an exercise in relation to a death
Yes,
involving an FAI.
yes.
And how long did that training take for the team?
I think we spent most part of a day in the house.
And then did all the investigators go and see an FAI, or just ones that had not seen one before?
We started with those who had not seen one before, but it was open and available to all, depending on other responsibilities, as you appreciate.
Right, of course. And as well as recruiting staff and training staff, were you also involved in creating policies and procedures for PIRC?
Yes, I was, yes.
And did you create or instruct the creation of any guidance for staff?
That was a work in progress, yes. Most definitely we were looking at standard operating procedures and the likes, many of which were already available from other organisations, and it was about ensuring that they were fit for purpose for the PIRC as an organisation.
Now, you've told us you had around 5 months before PIRC were due to start. What work did you do in terms of reviewing standard operating procedures from other organisations and making them fit for
Yeah,
the
that was
purpose of PIRC?
part of the ongoing work. Once we had employed the senior investigators, it was initially, because unfortunately Scullion didn't join till slightly later because she had to work a notice period with her ex-employer. But yes, I utilised at that stage the senior the investigators, of whom there were two at that stage, and we worked around SOPs and standard operating procedures and protocols, etc.
Do you remember what you started with? Can you give us any examples?
I think family liaison was probably quite early on in that process. We considered that, albeit it was later in the whole process, once we get trained family liaison officers in and up to speed, we continued with that type of work. It was around, and that went on for quite a time as well, and memorandum of understanding with Crown and with Police Scotland and with the police authority, particularly in relation to the provision of forensic support. So these things were all going at the early stage of development.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to look at some documents for me.
Yep.
But before I do that, can I just finalise my questions on one area, which is regard to training?
Yes.
You've given us a description of the training that was going on. I think in your inquiry statement, and I don't need to go to you at 657, you said that you were asked about diversity and race training for staff, and you described it as much of a disjoint or disjointed?
Yes, I think at the end of the day that many of our investigators over a period of time had diversity training, particularly those who were working with public bodies. As I think we did not have bespoke human resources within PIRC or PCCS at that time. I know that later on there was certainly training for all staff in relation to matters concerning diversity.
Right. When you say later on, when
Certainly beyond the 1st of April 2013, and I think maybe it was 18 months to 2 years, again from memory. It might even have been longer than that.
Right. We've obviously been talking about the death of Mr. Bio.
Yes, indeed.
And that occurred in May
Yes, it did.
2015.
Yeah.
From your memory, did the diversity training take place prior to that or after?
I think it was after, from memory.
All right, thank you. So before I move on to the documents, looking at that 5-month period
Yeah.
between the 1st of November and the 1st of April 2013, there was a lot going on from your description of recruitment and training and getting people in post.
Yes.
Looking back now, what are your thoughts or reflections on that timescale?
It was a massive challenge, because also built into that was the need to vet all of the staff before they could get access to Scottish Government-based computer systems, etc.
How long was that process taking?
Well, it was undertaken by the vetting department within Scottish Government, and it varied depending on how busy they were. It could take weeks, some took months on occasions. It was very demanding as far as the time was concerned, very demanding. Because as I think I explained earlier, we didn't actually have office premises at that time. They were being remodelled. We didn't have access to motor vehicles. We were in negotiation with the hire companies, etc. And I know that might sound like the minutiae, but that takes time.
So looking back now, do you think you had enough time to set up an entirely new investigations team as part of a new body PIRC?
Would I have liked longer? Yes. Was that an option? No, because the position was that PIRC would be up and running on the 1st of April 2013 in line with the new Police Service of Scotland. There was never any suggestion that that could be delayed, none whatsoever.
And in terms of being ready on the 1st of April 2013, had there been plans and propositions put in place looking at the number of cases that you'd have to handle, the number of investigations the team would have to deal with, and the resourcing for each of those?
Well, that was the other major challenge for me. I think I mentioned briefly earlier. In gathering information to truly understand what the demand profile would be was almost impossible. Even Crown were unable to say just exactly how many investigations they would consider that we would receive in a year. And in fact, I think it was mentioned at one time, maybe a handful or no more. I think we found out very, very quickly after the 1st of April that that wasn't the case.
Right. Again, looking back now to the 1st of April 2013, do you think you had sufficient resources in PIRC to cover the investigations that you were going to be expected to handle?
Because of the difficulty around the profile of the type of investigations and the numbers, because numbers are only one thing. A profile of an investigation, some investigations will take no longer than 2-3 days, maybe a week. Others last much longer than that and are far more resource intensive. So it is very, very difficult to get a clear understanding of how many people you need. unfortunately, it wasn't a blank cheque. So ultimately, I had to build an organisation within finite resources. As we moved beyond that, and we gathered evidence which clearly showed that the demand was greater than we might first have thought, yes, the Scottish Government did provide limited extra funding to expand the organisation. But I think as an investigator, you would always like more, but there's got to be a realism around it.
We heard some evidence from Mr. McSporran that the Sheco Bio investigation was significantly complex
Yes.
and lasted over a very long period. In terms of the type of investigations that PIRC were carrying out, was that at the upper range of complexity?
I would say so, and shortly after Mr. Bio's tragic death, there was another tragic incident within Police Scotland, deaths in the M9 motorway, which happened within a number of months. So clearly that brought more pressure to be in our finite resources. There's no doubts that it was challenging.
Right. I was going to ask you to look at some documents.
Yes.
I wonder if we could start with PIRC 04446. You'll see this on the screen, and we've
Yes.
just moved on from the date, which is Monday 12th of November 2012. Do you
Yep.
see that at
Yes,
the
I
top?
do, yes.
Now, that would have been 11 or 12 days after you started
Yes.
officially in your position. And it's headed Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, Operational Model, Response to Article 2 Investigations. Do you recognise this document?
I do, yes.
And I think in your statement, you say this formed quite a bit of discussion in the run-up to the 1st of April 2013.
Yes.
When was this? Was this completed in November 2012?
I think it was, and from memory again, I believe that was with the assistance of other members of the steering group. I think I spoke earlier. One member in particular, the superintendent from Police Scotland, who was seconded to that group. So, at the early stages and before I had senior staff, I had to rely on assistance from that seconded member of staff. So, given the importance of investigations in relation to Article 2 and 3, it was important to get that document formalised and up and running as soon as we could, so that we could use it to explain to staff, and so that staff would understand the responsibility in relation to that. So that, now that I see it, that was certainly one of the earlier documents. I apologise for 9 years. It's 9 years ago, and I couldn't be quite specific in what order these documents were prepared and became ready.
Don't apologise. We'll go through these documents,
Okay.
and you can tell us your views. So, if we could look briefly at your inquiry statement, actually, 629. And this might help refresh your memory. You were asked to look at the document, and you say, that's the document there, response to Article 2 investigations. It identifies on page 2 the principles of independence and an effective investigation to be the most important to PIRC.
Yes.
I certainly had a hand in drafting it,
Yep.
is that correct?
Yes, definitely.
That's my initials. That whole matter formed quite a bit of discussion in the run-up to 1st April, but certainly that was under discussion before
Yes.
I was even appointed in the role on the 1st of November. There were ongoing discussions we were having with Police Scotland and Crown about the independent aspect of the PIRC.
Yes.
And you've said that on page 2 of the document, the principles of independence and an effective investigation are the most important to PIRC.
Yes.
Tell us about how important they were in terms of your sharing of that with the staff.
Well, they underpinned everything that we would be expected to do if we were conducting an investigation where Article 2 was invoked.
And if we can go back to the document 4446, please. And if we can look at page 2. We've heard some evidence about this document already from other witnesses.
Yes.
And the chair has it available, so I won't ask you detailed questions about every paragraph.
Okay.
But I wonder if we could look at page 2, paragraph 5, which is the one that begins the Human Rights Act, 1998. And obligations imposed under Article 2 apply equally to, I think that's Police Service of Scotland,
Yes.
Crown Office,
Yes.
and PIRC.
Yep.
So was your understanding that Article 2 obligations apply to all bodies
Yes.
who were
it was,
involved?
yes.
And where Article 2 is engaged, the police service have a duty to ensure that they conduct themselves in a manner that is consistent with the 5 procedural obligations that the courts have held to exist.
Yep.
So these are obligations you viewed on police.
Yep.
And you then give them in bullet points, there's 5.
Yep.
The investigation must be independent insofar as it should have no hierarchical or institutional connection to those implicated. The investigation must be effective. The investigation must be reasonably prompt. There must be a sufficient element of public scrutiny, and the next of kin must be involved
Yes.
to an appropriate extent.
Yes.
Now, can I be clear? It goes on to say, so far as this document is concerned, it's the first 2 obligations that are relevant and which must be observed by the police, PIRC, and the Crown. That wasn't to suggest that only the first 2 were relevant, was it?
No, I would agree that when I read that now, that's not particularly well worded, and I would also agree that where it says in the paragraph immediately above the bullet points that the police service have a duty to ensure that everyone or all of the bodies mentioned in the line above had an equal responsibility to those duties.
So as far as you were concerned, and you've said that you were one of the authors of the
Yes.
document, in terms of the Article 2 obligations, they applied equally to all 3 bodies, including PIRC,
Yes.
even though that just
Yes.
refers to the
yes.
police.
No, that's poor.
Yeah, all right. So you mentioned the hierarchical connection earlier. Where it says institutional connection, can you explain what that meant?
I think again it was more of a cover-all. Sorry, so ultimately, I know that within the legislation there was provision for the commissioner, if they chose, to second police officers to augment the numbers in an investigation where there was a challenge around resources. And I think that institutional aspect related to that type of provision, I would quickly have to say, however, that was never given consideration by any of the commissioners that I worked with, because we believed that diluted the independence.
Thank you. And then if we could turn to page 5. Paragraph 1. There's a reference here to providing the direction that officers should not confer prior to recording their first account.
Yes.
We've heard quite a lot of evidence about conferral
Yeah.
and separation of officers. Can you tell us what your understanding of the position was?
Separation of officers is a difficult thing. I think this process is usually, or should be, conducted under the direction of a post-incident manager. So a senior police officer, and it's normally in relation to firearms incidents, but I've often thought that in any circumstance where a death or serious injury has occurred, that it's transferable. That process would be transferable. Now, I know that my experience of PIM tells me that as well as being the initial source for gathering evidence, initial statements, initial beliefs of the officers, it is also used as a support function for officers as well.
We've heard evidence that as part of the post-incident procedure and the management of officers, that they can be asked to provide initial accounts.
Yes, that's right.
Or brief
Initial
facts.
accounts, and then you would have an expectation that they would follow that up within, I think it's 48 hours from memory, with a full operational statement.
And that's more of a detailed statement taken within 48 hours of the incident.
Yes.
So when this document was being prepared and when PIRC came into existence a matter of months later, did you have a clear idea in your own mind about what the position on conferral would be
Yes.
in an incident?
Sorry, yes, I did, and indeed, in my time within the police service, I had responded initially to a police shooting and was aware of the PIM process and what the expectations would be. As I say, it was argued regularly about the need to separate, but I certainly would expect that there should have been someone there to ensure that there was no conferring, and that should have been made clear to the officers.
Right. And I think if we look at page 8, there's a section called Additional Advice to Staff. There we are. And if we can have that on the screen. And it, yes, at the bottom of paragraph 1,
Yep.
it says, we must be clear we're not seeking for officers to be separated, and we understand that they're entitled to legal advice.
Yeah.
Each case will be dealt with on its own merits. And it then goes on to say, it should be pointed out that the adoption of this process is to obtain best evidence, to preserve the principles of accountability and independence, and should not be seen as attributing guilt at an early stage.
Yes.
So, sorry. Right, sorry, I lost my page there. So was it the expectation by PIRC that staff would not be separated as such, but there would be someone there supervising?
Yes.
Or that separating them was an option also?
Separation was always a difficulty, for the reason that I outlined there, that police also understood that the PIM process, post-incident management process, could also be, and was indeed, a support role for officers who had probably just been involved in a tragic and demanding set of circumstances. The very least that my expectation would be that it was made clear to those officers that they did not discuss what had occurred, and that it was their own personally held belief that was the evidence, not a shared belief, a discussed belief, but their honestly held belief.
And actually on the screen, just under the additional advice for staff, do we see in the second line there a reference to what you've just said, an honestly held belief?
Yes.
Thank you. And do we also see in the paragraph just below the middle of the page, it should be pointed out that, do you see that paragraph?
Yes, yes.
Can you look at line 4, at the very end, it starts, the PIRC is clear
Yes.
that its investigators do not treat officers as suspects unless there is evidence that an offence has been committed. And was that the position?
That's absolutely the position, yes.
And at what point would it would give rise to a situation that it was clear that there was evidence that an offence had been committed? How did a PIRC investigator come to that view?
That might be some time down the line, because ultimately what you're relying on there is following the evidence. So ultimately you're still expecting the officers to produce operational statements. You would then read these operational statements, consider those statements, and consider the other evidence that was available to you at that time. Now, it would be at that stage, if it were possible, that you would again consider the officer's status, whether they were either a witness or whether it was reasonable to suspect that they had been involved in a criminal act.
Thank you. Can we now look at PIRC 04453? And again, this is a document we've already heard some evidence about, but you mentioned a memorandum.
Yes.
Is this a memorandum of understanding between the Crown Office and PIRC? And is this a document you recognise?
I do, yes.
And I think, without the need to go to the last page, it's signed on behalf of PIRC on the 10th of December 2015
Okay.
and the 11th of December, 13, and the 11th of December 2013. So
Yes.
it's signed by both the Crown Office and PIRC in December 2013.
Yes.
And was this the document that you were referring to earlier when you mentioned a memorandum?
Yes, it was indeed, yes.
And I wonder if we could look at this. We could maybe start first of all by looking at page 2. So this document came into existence or was signed around 8 months after PIRC came into existence. Was this something that you were working on as part of your role of director?
Yes, it was an ongoing piece of work. It was also an ongoing piece of work within Crown Office, and it needed that agreement before it would reach a final stage.
Thank you. And it sets out at the beginning the statutory background and the functions of initially the role of the Crown Office, and then at the bottom of that page, PIRC's statutory responsibilities.
Yes.
You've already mentioned B1 and B2, which we see starting at
Yes.
the bottom of that page. I'm interested in section 5, which is on page 4. And this is the role of PIRC in investigations.
Yes.
And it sets out here, again, the statutory background, the powers of PIRC investigators, and stipulates that PIRC is independent from the police service.
Yes.
And looking at 5.5, we see PIRC investigations are intended to comply with the 5 principles of effective investigation outlined by the European Convention of Human Rights: independence, adequacy, promptness, and so far as possible public scrutiny and victim involvement.
Yes, and I think we agree that that should have been included in the first document we looked at. That it was beyond just the police responsibility.
But equally, the 5 principles that are identified are mirroring the ones that were included in the first document as
Yes,
well.
indeed.
So again, is this something that staff were trained in relation to
Yes.
their role?
Yes.
And then can we turn to the third document, which is PIRC 04438. Now, this is headed up PIRC Independent Investigative Processes following police use of firearms. Again, we've heard evidence about this. The inquiry have been advised that this document is dated the 17th of June 2014.
Okay.
It's not contained within the body of the document. Do you agree with that, or was it prepared earlier or at a different time?
Again, I think that that was one of the documents that we considered relatively early on. So it would be one of the earlier documents. I'm sorry, I can't put an exact date.
No, that's what. Would this document have been in place and available to PIRC investigators prior to the 3rd of May 2015?
Yes.
Thank you. And in relation to this, I've asked a number of witnesses about this document, and it says at the top it's to do with firearms.
Yeah.
But as we look down towards paragraph 5, down the page, we'll see that the definition of firearms includes the discharge of CS gas.
Yes.
And as I read your inquiry statement, I think you said you firmly believed that this was transferable and did include situations involving the discharge of a CS gas. Is that right?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, CS gas is a permitted weapon in terms of the Firearms Act, so that had to be given that consideration. Maybe not as such a demanding investigation as if someone had been shot using a conventional firearm, but as a result of that, where CS gas is discharged, the Commissioner, or certainly 6 years ago when I left, conducted an investigation into all of these discharges.
So would this document be helpful for investigators who are not just simply investigating a shooting, but any discharge of gas, any use of a firearm?
Yes.
Right. And so this document could be relied on by investigators at the time of May 2015?
I believe so, yes.
Thank you. And you've talked about, obviously, the profile of investigations. Some are much more complex.
Yes.
A police shooting perhaps would be classed in that way, but there could be less complex cases such as the use of a taser or the use of CS
Yes,
gas.
definitely.
And the circumstances can be adapted depending on the profile and the complexity.
Yeah,
of the
a
investigation.
triage process to see just exactly what level of investigation would be required would be the best way to describe it.
Thank you. Well, I would like to move on now to your involvement on the 3rd of May,
Yes.
but I'm also conscious it's now 11:30.
We'll take a 20-minute break at that point. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We were going to move on.
Yes.
And I was going to ask you questions about PIRC's involvement with the events of the 3rd of May 2015.
Yes.
Can you clear something up for me, first of all?
Yes, indeed.
Now, when I read your inquiry statement, I understood that you were on holiday on the 3rd of May, and you didn't return to work till the 5th of May.
That's correct.
But Mr. Little, when he was giving evidence, thought you were there on the 4th of May, and I just wondered if you could clear that up.
No, absolutely. I was on holiday on the 3rd of May and did not return until the Tuesday the 5th of May.
All right, thank you. Now, I've asked you questions about the Article 2.5 principles.
Yes.
And rather than going through your inquiry statement in order, I would like to talk to you about those 5 principles and ask you questions in that sort of structure.
Okay.
So can we start with independence?
Yes.
And I'll ask you some questions about that first of all. I would like to, keeping independence in mind, I would like to ask you, you've told us about talking to staff and reinforcing the importance of independence for the investigation for PIRC. But if independence was challenged or threatened in some way, how would you have expected your team of investigators to handle that situation?
If we're talking about a conflict of interest type scenario, I would expect them to be upfront and report that that was the case.
Right. We've heard some evidence that there was a code of conduct in place,
Yep.
and that there is a requirement for staff to declare interest.
Yes.
And was that something that the staff were aware of?
Yes, indeed, yes.
And did you find, did you experience examples where staff did declare interest?
Not to my knowledge, no. There was certainly a register of interest, you're absolutely right. If there was invites to certain meetings or certain events, etc. But I think we were a bit more straightforward within that whole area of investigation. That if an investigator identified that they had had pre-knowledge or of an individual who they were going to be asked to participate in an investigation about, there was a duty placed on them to make that known to the senior investigator.
Right. And then presumably a decision could be taken about whether they should be involved or...
Absolutely, yes.
Now, in relation to an officer, a serving officer, who they're being asked to investigate, where does the line get drawn with that decision? We've heard evidence that some people were aware of senior officers, some people had passed them in a corridor, or they'd maybe worked with them. Where would that line be drawn?
You would have to look at every set of circumstances in its own merit, I would suggest, but so far as you could, you would not have an investigator involved directly in an investigation which saw them encountering someone that they knew well. The Scottish Police Service is a small organisation in real terms. The greater majority of training is delivered centrally at the Scottish Police College. There is a chance that through a 30-year stay in the police, for want of a better word, that you will come across officers who you would not consider as friends, but merely colleagues for a brief period of time. I would have an expectation that an investigator would identify any such association, and then it's down to the senior investigator or the senior staff members to decide whether or not that it would be appropriate to utilise that investigator on that inquiry or on a particular line of inquiry.
Can I ask you, what is your view now about someone who had perhaps not necessarily been a friend, but had been a line manager of an investigator? Would you expect that sort of connection to be declared?
Yes.
And if a connection was to be declared, would you consider it sufficient that at some point in the past a declaration had been made? Or would you expect an investigator to say, every time he's being asked to perhaps investigate a matter where the line manager is involved in some role, would you expect them to repeat that declaration?
I think that would be best practice, yes.
And then you would consider with the senior manager what the appropriate course of action was.
Absolutely, yes.
And we've heard evidence that that appropriate action may involve saying to the investigator, you're not getting involved with this investigation.
Yes, indeed.
Depending on the connection and
Yeah.
the possible conflict.
Yes.
Was one of the factors that you considered how things would look to the public in terms of thinking about independence?
Yes, perceptions is very, very important. Very important. So it was something that we considered.
Why do you consider the public perception very important?
Because we rely on the public support during investigations. The public need to understand what's happening. That way you will win their trust and their assistance.
Thank you. As well as declaring a conflict in relation to maybe a connection with an officer
Yes.
who's involved in an investigation, was there an expectation on PIRC investigators to declare more personal interests that could cause or give rise to conflict? Groups, membership of societies?
Yes, absolutely there would be, yes.
Right. So even if there wasn't a professional or a work connection, you would expect people to declare a personal connection?
If it impinged on their ability to conduct themselves in a manner which would be considered to be independent, absolutely.
And equally, would best practice be to declare it and have it out in the open and discuss it?
Yes,
And for a decision then to be made and recorded?
yes.
And can I ask, you talked earlier about hierarchical connections and institutional connections. Was there ever any consideration given to the institutional connection with Scottish Police Federation? We've heard about the Scottish Police Federation and their involvement with officers who are serving. My understanding is that they also deal with matters, at least initially, in relation to pensions and corresponding with people who have retired
Yes.
in connection with their pension. Is that right?
I was a member of ASPS when I retired, so the Federation were not part of my life at that time. But they are still serving police officers. They hold the rank of constable.
Even after they've retired?
No, once I retired, sorry, not once I retired. I'm speaking about existing Federation members.
No, I'm thinking about the connection, so obviously independence, and thinking about the connection which may or may not exist for individuals with Scottish Police Federation, who perhaps continue to support former retired police officers and serving officers who may also be receiving support from the Scottish Police Federation. They're obviously both members or involved with the Federation.
Yes.
Was that seen as any sort of institutional connection that caused any concern to PIRC?
No, not to my knowledge. It's not something I must admit I considered.
And so not something that anyone ever declared as part of the avoiding a conflict or anything along those lines?
No.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about parallel investigations or a split investigation at the
Yes.
outset.
Yes.
And that initially at least PIRC were to deal with the events at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May and afterwards at the
Yes.
hospital.
That's correct.
And the police continued to be responsible for the investigation for the events leading up to
That's
the
correct,
arrival
yes.
at Hayfield Road. And we've heard evidence from a number of witnesses about that. When you came back to work on the 5th of May, we've heard there was a letter of instruction on the 5th of May,
Yeah.
but when you arrived back at work that day, do you remember what the position was at that time?
At that time when I arrived in the office that morning, it was as you have described, that the police still had the responsibility under the direction of Crown to continue with their investigation up to the point where the police officers became involved with Mr. Bio.
What were your thoughts about that?
I didn't think it was appropriate, and I certainly didn't think it was appropriate after the post-mortem findings. I thought that for that whole area of perception and reality, that we should be dealing with all of those matters, the matters that occurred before, that were relevant to the investigation, and everything afterwards. I believe that's the way that it should be done.
You mentioned the post-mortem. What was it about that that made you think that things should have changed?
Well, when I came in and learned that there had actually been police officers present at the post-mortem, that surprised me.
Why?
Well, it didn't gel with me, but having then sat down and thought about it, post-mortem, as we know, is arranged by the Crown. There was a senior procurator fiscal present at the post-mortem. The police still had a part of the investigation to consider. And initially I thought that there were police officers present there because of that. But it didn't gel with me, to be honest.
And when you say it didn't gel with you,
I thought it was unusual when we had been directed to investigate circumstances around arrest and Mr. Bio's death.
and from the perspective of independence
Yes.
and the independence of PIRC
Yes.
in the investigation into his death,
Yes.
what concerns, if any, did you have about the police being present at the post-mortem? We've heard this took place on the 4th of May.
Yes, it took place before I returned. I was surprised. My opinion, and it is my opinion, it would have been much better had the police not been involved in that process.
And if they had not been involved, what would the benefits have been from your perspective?
The independence, we would have known what had happened at that post-mortem. We would know the outcome at that stage, and that would have maintained our independence within that investigation, in my opinion.
Thank you. As I say, we've heard that a written letter of instruction came in on the 5th of May.
Yes.
And that was the first letter of instruction from the Crown to PIRC.
Yeah.
Do you remember at what point of day that came in?
I think it was maybe mid-morning from memory.
And I think it was at that stage that PIRC took over the whole investigation.
Yes.
And so you were in the office on the 5th of May.
The Tuesday, sorry, yes, the Tuesday, yes.
From what you've said about the post-mortem, had you been in the office on the 4th of May when the post-mortem was being carried out, what would your view have been about having the police at the post-mortem?
Had I been there, had I known about it, I would have questioned the necessity.
And had you become aware of information from the post-mortem, from the pathologist, what would your view have been about sharing that information with police officers?
Well, I suppose the matter there is that the information all belongs to the Crown at that stage. The pathologist is doing that post-mortem on behalf of the Crown. I would not have shared it without express permission of the Crown.
Right. So without that express permission, you simply would not have
No,
permitted disclosure?
No.
We've also heard evidence about the ongoing reliance of PIRC on Police Scotland and their resources.
Yes.
And to summarise a lot of evidence we've heard that it's integral to the role of PIRC that in fact they are forced to rely on
Yes.
the resources of Police Scotland.
Yes.
Do you agree with that, obviously? We've heard that some investigations require a lot of manpower, if I can use that word, which Police Scotland have
Yeah.
a lot of, and PIRC don't.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
When you came into the role, let's look at your inquiry statement, paragraph 176, please. And you were asked as part of your statement to consider evidence that we'd heard from D.S. Campbell.
Yes.
He was the SIO on the 3rd of May, and he commented on resources and expressed the view that he thought PIRC had insufficient resources on the 3rd of May. He said that Police Scotland had significant resources pulled from all over the country, as well as from the major investigation team to support PIRC. And I think you were asked at 177 to comment on Campbell's evidence, and then if we can look at 179. You see, it was certainly insufficient to go searching houses and take on that wider area that the police had been left with. But if it was management of Mr. Byles' remains, the hospitals and the officers, trying to get statements from them, I think with the numbers that could have been done. The problem with that is around independence and perception of independence. To take that offer, which is almost what Pat Campbell is making there, to give some of these tasks to police officers, when Crown have directed that we conduct that part of the investigation, could be seen to dilute that independence. And you have always got to remember that as an investigator. I'm interested in this paragraph. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, that still is my position. We have spoken earlier there about the type of investigation, the 5 main principles, the absolute requirement for independence, and that independence would have to stand scrutiny. And I just do not see a position where police officers, serving police officers, can be directly involved in an investigation being run by the PIRC under the direction of Crown as an independent investigation and maintain the correct levels of independence. Now, if it's about uniformed officers stopping motor cars on a day when you're returning to the scene and taking no part in interviewing witnesses, that's acceptable. I do not see it being acceptable to be involved directly in conducting elements of the investigation which require to remain independent.
And would that be any officers being involved, taking statements of witnesses?
As soon as that inquiry becomes ours in all aspects, yes.
So we've heard evidence that some officers came from other offices in Fife to assist with the investigation. Yeah. Does that alleviate the concerns you've just expressed?
No, because there's still that hierarchical association with Police Scotland. They are members of Police Scotland regardless of whatever division they come from.
Right. And you use the words directly involved with the investigation. Could you assist the Chair by giving an example of what you mean when you say directly involved?
Well, just that. On the Sunday of the week following Mr. Byles' death, the investigators returned to the scene in Hayfield Road with a view to identifying whether there were other witnesses available. Now, that meant stopping motor cars, for example, and that needed a uniformed police presence. So assistance at that type of level is appropriate. It can't be done. What you wouldn't have would be those officers engaged in interviewing anyone who you spoke or noting statements from them.
Thank you. So taking a step back and looking at things from the point of view of independence, but also bearing in mind the resources available to PIRC. At that time, you said you had 20 investigators and 2 senior people, yourself and Ms. Scullion. How were you balancing the demand for independence and the limited resources on the 5th of May and beyond?
Had to take the decision that that was how it was, that was what was available to us. To maintain independence, we would only use members of PIRC staff to conduct the investigation. Now, we realise that that may prolong an investigation. However, I think that's the lesser evil than giving up the degree of independence.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about how the instructions from Crown were extended, expanded. So there was the initial terms of reference.
Yes.
On the 5th of May, the written letter saying do the whole investigation. But further letters of instruction were sent.
Yes.
We've gone through a number of those with Mr McSporran through his policy log. How did PIRC cope as the scope of the investigation and the terms of reference expanded and were extended, but resources remained reasonably fixed at that stage?
Yes, it became more difficult. There's no time, and I think the main outcome there was it prolonged the investigation at that stage, because you have finite resources. But again, to reiterate, I think that the independence of that investigation is paramount.
We heard evidence from Mr Little that it was all hands on deck, bar one.
Yes.
Was that your recollection of
Yes,
events?
and
at that
indeed
time?
we took the unusual step of me having a discussion with the head of review and utilising some of his staff as support for corroboration while undertaking house-to-house inquiries so that we could bolster our numbers. They were not investigators. It was purely and simply so that we could split the investigators but give them a person who could corroborate information received, etc. And that was the extent that we had moved to, but it was still, in my view, the correct line as against accepting assistance from the police to supply serving police officers.
We've heard from Mr Little that there were around 6 or perhaps 7 case handlers who came on board into the investigation team at that point.
That was right, yes. I think that was as many as there were at that time. I think that operation in real term ceased for that short period of time.
Do you remember when that happened?
It was early on in the investigation, because one of the earliest thrusts was around to house investigation at the scene at Hayfield Road. So it was early on.
Looking back now, do you consider that PIRC had sufficient resources to investigate Mr Byles' death?
I think I said earlier it would always be better to have more. But the truth of the matter was we had what we had. It's therefore then becomes incumbent on the senior investigator and the senior management for that part to ensure that lines of investigation are prioritised and that those with the highest priority are dealt with first. You know that it's going to take longer. That is a fact of life. There was no way to increase an independent body in short term.
I was going to ask you, looking back now, do you think there's anything else you could have done at that stage to bring in investigators into your team, or people who could support the investigation team?
No, I don't. And I mentioned earlier, you're using equipment, systems that are linked to Scottish Government. There would be a process around vetting these individuals, and that in itself would take time. So I think it was very, very much a matter of prioritisation and moving forward with what we had at that time, whilst gathering evidence of the lack of staff. And that was ongoing constantly. That was actually one of the commitments that Professor McNeill made on the 1st of April to Scottish Government, that when we were able to better understand the demand profile, we would be coming back with business cases to increase the establishment.
And was that ultimately done?
Yes, it was. It was at least 2 business cases in my time, yes. And additional cash did come from government at that time.
And obviously from the perspective of having been retired for a number of years, would you have any suggestions or thoughts about how that situation could be alleviated if it happened again in the future?
I don't, simply because you're relying on people with experience. There would have been absolutely no point in augmenting numbers purely for the numbers' sake. It had to be people who had an understanding and were capable of working in that environment.
You mentioned earlier about the possibility of seconding officers. You obviously indicated that that had not been done.
No.
Looking back now, is that something that could have been considered, or did your reservations and concerns override that?
I didn't consider it as a reasonable and realistic proposition.
So again, looking back now, you still would not second officers.
I can't, and having not been there for 6 years, but I can't imagine a circumstance where I would allow the independent aspect of the inquiry to be compromised by that decision.
Thank you. We have heard evidence that Police Scotland were involved in recovering clothing and PPE from officers. Uniformed officers were securing the scene. Uniformed officers and CID officers were going to houses to seize them, take evidence from the occupiers, clothing, DNA, searching houses, seeking warrants, interviewing people, tracing people, forensic matters. I take it all the comments you've made about your concerns regarding independence would apply to all of these aspects.
They would do, but my understanding was that that didn't relate to our initial direction from Crown to deal with the matter from the point of contact at Hayfield Road. That seizing with the exception of maybe the officer's uniform, clothing, etc., the rest of the examples you gave there related to the instruction from Crown to police to investigate matters prior to.
So the concerns you have in relation to PIRC independence really kick in from the point of the 5th of May when you get your letter of instruction,
Yes.
insofar as it relates to events leading up to.
Yes.
Thank you. You've talked about public perception, public awareness. We've heard about officers remaining at the scene. In light of what you've just said, do you have fewer concerns about that?
I have fewer concerns about that because what they're being tasked to do is preserve the scene. They are not being asked to interview witnesses. They're not being directed to take any action other than to remain there until they are stood down.
And something you say in your inquiry statement, you have some comments about the name of PIRC. It begins with the word police.
Yes, that was always a challenge to me as well. I mean, again, it's more to do with perception than reality. But if you stick the word police on front of the organisation's name like that, unfortunately, people will believe that you are a branch of the police, in my opinion.
And so would you recommend a change of name?
I would have loved a change in name, yes.
Is that something you discussed when you were in post?
Yes, but it was enshrined in legislation.
Right. And you also comment in your statement about PIRC investigators wear jackets that identify that they are members of
Yes.
PIRC.
Yeah.
Was there some sort of uniform for PIRC investigators?
There wasn't a uniform per se, but we did go out and purchase jackets, anorak type jackets, or coveralls which displayed the name PIRC on the back in an attempt to separate our investigators from police officers if they were at the same scene at any given time.
Thank you. We've heard some evidence, and there's evidence available to the chair, that a number, you've already spoken of, a number of investigators, particularly senior investigators, were ex-police officers.
Yes.
And thinking about independence and public perception, did that become an ongoing concern for you, that there were so many former police officers involved?
This is where the 5 months time frame comes in. To be ready and have the capability and the experience to deal with the type of investigations that we thought we might inherit, we needed to have people who had experience in dealing with those. And senior investigators within the police have that experience. Had you had a run-in period of 2 to 3 years, it would have been a different matter altogether. But to bring someone from no knowledge or little knowledge to a situation where they have the ability and experience conduct an intricate and challenging investigation is not possible within 5 months. So it was a difficult set of circumstances, but it was a set of circumstances that we were faced with.
I've asked other witnesses from PIRC about their own personal contacts and connections with serving officers at the time.
Yep.
And I think in your inquiry statement you say that you did know Rory Nicholson,
I did,
who was
yes.
the ACC and the Gold Commander,
Yeah.
Gary McEwen,
Yes.
Pat Campbell,
Yes.
Leslie Bowl,
Yes.
and I've asked all the other witnesses, can they explain their level of connection with
Yep.
the people they knew?
Yep.
And I'd like to do the same with you. If we can begin with ACC Nicholson.
Yeah, I worked with Mr. Nicholson for a long period of time in the late 80s, early 90s in the Serious Crime Squad within the then Strathclyde. Mr. Nicholson rose through the ranks relatively quickly and became head of CID, the role that I finally had when I retired. I was a detective during that whole process and clearly had contact with him on many occasions. Ultimately, he, as head of CID, had a deputy, and I was the deputy for a period of time.
And was that something that you felt the need to declare when you became involved in this investigation?
Oh, absolutely.
You did.
Absolutely.
Who did you declare that to?
Well, I spoke to John McSpawn, but John McSpawn and others knew of that association.
Right. The only person higher than you in the hierarchy, as I understand it, is the Commissioner
That's correct, yes.
themselves. And we may hear from the Commissioner at that time, who I understand was Kate Frame.
Yes, it was.
Was that something you discussed with her?
I just made the decision that I wasn't going to be involved with the investigation in a manner that would see me interview Mr. Nicholson or anyone else who I knew closely. And indeed, I didn't actually take a day-to-day part in the investigation in so much as I didn't interview people. I didn't do any of that.
Right. You then mentioned Gary McEwen.
Yeah,
Was he someone that you knew?
well, I knew Gary McEwen simply because at one stage of his career he was a detective superintendent within Fife, and I chaired the heads of CID meeting at the Scottish Police College in a quarterly manner, so I knew Mr. McEwen through that.
And did you also declare that as part of the discussion you had?
Well, I would have done had there been any suggestion that I would need to speak to Mr. McEwen, but that never arose.
Pat Campbell?
Pat Campbell was a detective sergeant and a detective inspector within the crime policy unit when I was a detective superintendent in charge of that department.
Did you declare your awareness of Pat Campbell?
Again, everybody knew that I was aware. I didn't take any part in any discussion or with Pat Campbell during the inquiry whatsoever.
Leslie Bow?
Leslie Bull I knew as a senior CID officer from the Lothians area when I was holding a similar role within Strathclyde Police. Our paths crossed at occasional training events, but beyond that, no, not really.
So in terms of declaring a connection, did you declare that you knew all of the officers you mentioned?
Yes.
And was there a decision then taken that would not prevent you from some involvement, at least as the Director of Investigations, in connection with this incident?
So long as I wasn't dealing directly with them, yes. All right. I think that's fair to say.
Thank you. You've mentioned earlier about people's awareness of PIRC.
Yes.
And I'm interested in your recollection about police officers' awareness of PIRC. You mention this at paragraphs 60 and 61 of your statement. We've heard from some officers that they maybe didn't have a clear picture of who PIRC were and what PIRC would do. Would that accord with your recollection in 2015?
It's disappointing to hear that. We did travel far and wide doing presentations in all areas of Scotland to police officers, to the Federation, to wider third parties like the ambulance service, etc. I also believe it's incumbent in serving police officers to keep up to date with change. And the formation of the PIRC was not a secret. And it was widely known and widely available within their systems what our roles were. If they didn't know, I'm disappointed to hear it, but I'm not quite sure what else we could have done to push that knowledge forward.
Would you recognise that perhaps there could be some confusion about PIRC's role by May 2015 in the minds of certain officers?
I would be surprised, and it would have been the responsibility for any of the PIRC staff coming in contact with a police officer who was unsure or unaware of the role to make sure it was explained to them. That would be my expectation. But I have to reiterate the fact that the police have a responsibility in themselves to keep up to date with change.
The other aspect of this I'm interested in is the evidence we've heard about a conversation that took place between Mr. Little and ACC Nicholson about the scope of the investigation. This took place on the 4th of May. You weren't back at work that day. But it was en route for Mr. Little. He was going to the post-mortem.
Okay.
And ACC Nicholson was expressing concern about the fact that the police were investigating the events leading up to Havel Road and PIRC were dealing with the later events. And he was concerned about the perception of the public with effectively split or parallel investigations running. And there was a discussion between Mr. Little and ACC Nicholson at that time. Separate from the possible confusion I was asking a moment ago, do you understand if there was confusion around the scope of each investigation? Because we have heard some evidence from officers that seemed to suggest they thought PIRC were coming in to take the lead on everything, rather than having an understanding that there was a split. Do you have any views about that? About, the possible confusion, the understanding of the police, because PIRC know what they're doing, they're coming in, but making officers fully aware of the the limitations of your investigation.
Sorry, that would be the responsibility of the senior investigating officer on the police side to ensure that
Right.
their staff knew exactly what their role was and the parameters of the investigation as far as they were concerned.
So that would be the police responsibility to explain that to officers rather than PIRC.
I would say so when they're directed to conduct that investigation by Crown, and I also think maybe that Mr Nicholson should have taken these concerns to Crown rather than to William Little.
Right. And from the point on the 5th of May where PIRC are given the entire investigation,
Yes.
at that point, does the responsibility for informing police staff change, or does it continue with Police Scotland?
I would say that it's the Police Scotland would then be in a position where they would withdraw their staff and make it quite clear to their staff that they were no longer playing a part in the investigation.
Thank you. Can I move on to what was the second of the bullet points under Article 2, which is the investigation should be adequate
Yeah.
or effective? I have some questions in relation to that,
Okay.
if I may. Can we look at paragraph 636 of your inquiry statement, please? I'm interested in which individual would be responsible for ensuring the adequacy or effectiveness of the investigation.
That's,
What-
sorry, that would be down to the senior investigating officer.
I was going to say, I think you were asked about this, and
Yep.
and you have said who at PIRC was ultimately responsible for the effectiveness of the investigation, and you said John McSporran would be.
Yes.
Now, we've heard that initially the lead investigator was Mr Harrower on the 3rd, then it became Mr Little, and then ultimately Mr McSporran came back from absence,
Yes.
and then his role evolved into effectively lead
Yes.
investigator. So in terms of the effectiveness and responsibility for that, you don't seem to be in any doubt it was for Mr McSporran.
Mr McSporran. By the 5th of May, when Mr McSporran was back to work, he had the responsibility to lead the investigation.
Was that your understanding
That
of
was
the
my
position?
understanding.
We've heard that he may have been initially appointed to have an oversight view, but then it evolved into lead investigator. Do you disagree with that?
I recall that he was asked to bring himself up to speed with what had occurred in the days prior, the 3rd and the 4th. It was always my intention that Mr McSporran would become the senior investigator to support Mr Little and to support one another for continuity purposes. And it was clearly going to be a complicated and protracted inquiry.
And we've heard that as well as being lead investigator, he was actually a senior investigator at that time. Is
Yes,
that correct?
that's correct.
And was there some sort of discussion about the situation with Mr McSporran and his appointment? Because we've heard that it was effectively 3 lead investigators over the course of 3 days.
Well, Mr Harrower was on call and was the initial response. He had been out for a considerable period of time on that day. My understanding is that on the Monday, that it was Irene Scullion who appointed Mr Little to take on that responsibility. And on the 3rd, decision was mine to give the inquiry a robustness and a support from an experienced investigator to work alongside Mr Little.
So when you come back to work on the 5th of May,
Yeah.
you take the view it should be a senior investigator, Mr McSporran, who's taking over.
I do.
And we have other evidence available that says the day-to-day responsibility for the investigation lay with Mr McSporran, and he was the lead senior investigator. And do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
And we've also got evidence available that he was under the supervision of you, the Director of Investigations?
Well, he was at all times.
Right. Were effectively all staff under your supervision?
Yes.
Can you explain to the Chair what that role looked like, supervising a large team?
Unfortunately, it wasn't a large
Or
team,
not a
but
large team.
it was to have an understanding of the day-to-day work and the challenges that the teams were facing. It was to understand what the priority at that time was. And it was much, much easier for me to instruct that investigators be taken from one inquiry to another to augment that inquiry at a time where a priority had to be met. So that was more my role. It was a kind of support function. I was available to be spoken to by the senior investigator, or anyone for that matter, if they were looking for my assistance or advice. The day-to-day running of the investigation, the lines of inquiry, setting priorities, ensuring that the work was carried out, was the role of the senior investigator. I think it's fair to say that I had an overarching responsibility for the whole investigative area of business.
We've heard from Mr. McSporran that he prepared a management policy log setting out decisions
Yes.
During the course of the investigation, and that having taken those decisions or moments captured on the log, the actions and tasks would then flow from
Yes,
those.
that's correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct,
And
yes.
that would all be Mr. McSporran's responsibility?
Absolutely, yes.
And would he update you on what he was doing?
Yes, and if there were particular areas that he believed that I needed to know, high priority, etc., where I could maybe assist with, as I've just explained, initially agreeing to take reviewers and support the house-to-house, or an approach to Scottish Government for more cash because we had to have more cars, or to discuss that with the head of corporate around overtime payments, to take that responsibility away from the senior investigator who was leading a complex investigation. That's the type of thing that I would take on behalf. But over and above that, if he wanted advice or sought advice and came to me, I would try and help.
So you would also be available to provide advice or guidance from you based on your experience?
Yes, absolutely.
Did Mr. McSporran come to you for guidance and advice in this investigation?
Not very often, but there were a couple of occasions where he found himself in a challenging position around certain aspects of the investigation. And yes, we would discuss that through, and he sought some advice, or quite often a discussion helps oil the wheels and get things moving.
And do you remember any examples of moments where he did seek your guidance or advice?
Around a particular data protection element of the investigation, where Mr. McSporran believed that he was not getting the assistance from the police that he would expect, and we talked that through.
We've heard some evidence from Mr. Little about that. We may come back
Okay,
to that at a later stage.
So it's that sort of high level where there was maybe what could be described as a reluctance or a perceived reluctance in the police to support the investigation. These things would be discussed with me.
We've heard that sometimes there was attempts to find a way through a difficult situation. Would that be the type of thing that...
Yes, quite often discussion, request rather than push forward. Try and explain why the course of action you're taking is so important. Try to reach an agreement rather than prolong the whole matter by going down a far more circuitous route.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about a briefing note, and I'd like to ask you about this. It's dated the 3rd of May.
Yes.
PIRC 03694. You were asked about this in your inquiry statement.
Yes,
And I appreciate it's dated. We've heard evidence it was prepared by Mr. Harrower
yes.
on the 3rd of May, but it was used on the 4th of May. And I want to ask you about any involvement you had with it on the 5th of May when you came back to work.
Okay.
So we're looking at it now on the screen. The date's the 3rd of May. Briefing note for Director of Investigations. So it's actually a briefing note for you.
That was the
heading it.
process.
Relating to the death of Mr. Bio, and the background information is given. And could we look at page 2, please? And we have heard some evidence about the paragraph that starts, it was reported, it's towards the bottom of the
Yes.
screen. It was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased coming towards them as the vehicles came to a halt. They could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. Some of the officers, unknown how many at this stage, drew their police issue batons. At least one of the officers also drew their pepper spray and issued a warning to the now deceased, who continued to come forward. I'm interested in whether this briefing note was put before you when you came back on the 5th of May.
That I saw that briefing note on the 5th of May, yes.
Did you? And we've heard from various witnesses the line where it says they could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them, and then it goes on to say that he continued to come forward after batons and sprays.
Yeah.
What was your impression at that time about the circumstances based on that briefing note?
I think, and I'm sure by that time, that I was aware that Mr. Bio was not in possession of a knife when he encountered the police in Hayfield Road, that indeed a knife was found in close proximity to the point of contact. So that, by then, in my view, is inaccurate.
So we've heard from Mr. McSporran that it was at a reasonably early stage where I think a statement from DC Connell, one of the police officers, had been received. He was aware at some early stage that a knife had been found some distance from where the incident occurred.
Yes.
And so that gave rise to an inference that Mr. Bio did not have a knife at the
Yes.
time the police approached him.
Yes.
And so that was made clear to you when you arrived?
Yes, I was aware of that, and it was quite clear that that briefing note was prepared before that information was known.
At any point, are you aware of PIRC investigating how it came to be that this information was initially provided to the police? So it says it was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they could clearly see he was in possession of a knife. We know at this time PIRC did not have statements, initial accounts, brief facts, anything like that from the officers. Was there ever an investigation to who had reported it or how it had become reported in that way?
Not that I'm aware, simply because by the 5th of May that we knew that that was completely inaccurate.
Right.
That by then we knew that Mr. Bio was not in possession of a knife. No knife was found, and as I've said previously, it was found nearby. I am not sure where that initial information came from.
So in terms of your awareness of the investigation, is it fair to say from your answers that that didn't have any impact on your understanding of the events?
No,
that
that
comment?
didn't know, because as I say, by then I knew that that was inaccurate.
Right. And was that something that the other investigators were also aware was inaccurate
Oh yes,
at that
they
time?
would know, because they would be briefed to that point.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about the deployment of staff on the 3rd and 4th of May. I appreciate you only came back to work on the 5th.
Yes.
And initially, the letter of instruction hadn't been received from Crown expanding the whole investigation.
Yes.
But I'm interested in any thoughts you have about the numbers deployed on the 3rd to to Kirkcaldy Police Office. Now, we've heard evidence that there were around 6 PIRC officers, investigators, deployed to Kirkcaldy. We've also heard evidence about one of the documents which talks about a minimum deployment of 9 to a scene and a PIM suite. And I'm interested in your reflections about the numbers that were sent on the 3rd.
Would it have been better had there been more there? Yes. It was a public holiday, the May Day weekend. I did question the number and was told that attempts had been made to contact staff and to increase the numbers, but that had been unsuccessful.
Right. And who was it you questioned?
I think, from memory, it was a group discussion, but Ricky Casey springs to mind.
We've heard that Ricky Casey remained in PIRC's premises that day. Did he tell you who had made the attempts to get more investigators
Sorry,
to
no,
help?
I don't think he went into that depth. It was just that attempts had been made and that they had managed to raise as many as they could at that time.
Do you have any thoughts now about Mr. Casey remaining in the office?
I would have preferred had they gone to Kirkcaldy.
Right.
That's the way I work.
When you say that's the way you work, what do you mean?
Well, I have, due to the pressure and staff around about that time, I also covered the on-call requirement just to alleviate some of the pressure on them. And then during the period around then, I was notified of 2 incidents, one a police shooting and one a fatal road traffic accident where a police vehicle had been involved in a follow rather than a pursuit with another car, and I tended the scene of both these incidents. That's the way I would prefer it to be done.
So even as Director of Investigations, you did get involved in doing jobs that were not part of your remit?
Yeah, well, absolutely. It was around the understanding the challenges, the pressures that were being put on staff, and standing up to show them that I was prepared, as they were, to do what was needed.
Thank you. I'm moving on to another aspect now. Would that be an appropriate time to...
We'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.